Hey everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Arthur's Custom Corner. And who better to start off the first episode than with everyone's favorite number one engine, Skarloey.
Who else were you expecting?
It only seemed right to kick off my series with one of my first custom engines. I say that with big air quotes around that just because I made this guy in 2017, and I was making customs before that, but those were the dark days. Anyway, I thought I'd start off simple with cabless Skarloey for my first video. Now, with a lot of my older customs, the reason I wanted to make them in the first place was so I could use them in my series. You know, that series that doesn't exist yet. But I wrote and filmed a good bit of an episode focused on Skarloey and Neil, and if I was going to go back in time, I would need a Skarloey that fit the setting. Funnily enough, I never intended on making a cabless Rheneas, and still have no plans to. One big motivation for me when making customs early on was using what I had on hand. I was very hesitant to buy things for my budding hobby of model making, albeit I was 16 and didn't have a job, so yeah. Luckily I had a spare Skarloey and set to work destroying it. Now, this cabless Skarloey was actually the first engine I took apart in order to paint. Most of my early models were basically the same engine with a new paint job and maybe a new face if they were lucky. But I knew I'd need to take apart this one because no amount of paint can cover up the fact that he's not supposed to have a cab. When taking apart wooden railway models, I typically use 3 different tools: an X-Acto knife to open up wedges between pieces, a sturdy flathead screwdriver for prying the pieces apart, and in the situations that call for it, a thin handsaw. Alright, now I can't emphasize this enough. Be safe when handling knives or other sharp objects or trying to take things apart. Don't just jam an X-Acto knife into a gap between wooden pieces. That's how knives can bend and break. Try to find a good angle to wedge the knife in slowly and do a slow sawing motion. The same applies for prying with the screwdriver. Make sure you have a sturdy one and point it away from your hands and body while using it. Believe me, I have the scars to remind me of what happens when I'm not so careful. So please, when doing any of this, be smart and safe. Don't rush, work slowly and methodically. And don't expect wooden railway pieces to just pop apart, especially not newer items. I got words for you, Bertram. Anyway, the chassis came from the Winter Caboose, a very useful model for making a lot of different little customs, and it's pretty cheap and easy to find. Once all the pieces were separated and assembled, it was time to paint. Now, I've gotten a lot of questions about what paint I use for my engines, which is, a bit of a difficult question to answer. The majority of my paint comes from color traditions, which, to the best of my understanding, doesn't exist anymore. I could be wrong, but I believe that they were at some point acquired by Deco Art, which is still a widely available acrylic paint brand. So, for Skarloey, the base coat was tomato red, and the lining was done with navy blue. I debated giving him white lining like in the TV series, but I opted for blue to be a little more accurate to the Railway series, as that's the only time we see him cabless. A mixture of yellow ochre and gold was used for the dome and other gold accents, and black and silver were used to make the firebox. I lined out his cylinders and side rods and gave them their paint jobs. I did mix a little red in with the silver for the side rods, as I couldn't decide whether I wanted them to be silver or red, so I went with a bit of both. Now, if you know me, you know there's one part of custom making that I absolutely hate, and that is the eyes. Painting within the molded eyes while keeping it smooth and not letting the paint spill into the areas around the eyes is the bane of my existence, because if you mess up, you need to wait for it to dry and then scrape it all off and start all over again. If anyone has any good eye painting techniques, please leave them in the comments. I'm desperate. A few mental breakdowns later, it came time to put everything back together. Now back in the day, I used to stick everything together with hot glue, Were I to remake this guy now, I would definitely say to use super glue, as that's what I use for all my customs these days. I made a little nameplate in Word, printed it out, and slapped it on there with a glue stick. The last thing he needed was a guardrail. Simple enough, I took a silver paperclip, bent it up, and cut it to shape. Originally, I cut up the paperclip with one horizontal bar connecting on both sides of the bunker, and 2 vertical bars holding it up. All of this was held together with hot glue, and I did not love the look of it. You could see the stringiness of the glue, and it was very fragile to touch. Thankfully, I took a look back at the Railway series drawings and saw I'd overcomplicated things, which I have a tendency to do. I made a new U-shaped guardrail and stuck it under the running board. And that's Skarloey. Now, since this model is roughly 7 years old, there are some improvements I'd like to make, were I to fully remake him. First, I'd like to swap out the rounded funnel with a molded one, and sand down the dome so I could put the new one in the correct place, like I did with Talifin. I'd also like to redo the nameplate, with it more accurately blending into the paint job and not being an actual name plaque. Most of the other changes I'd make are pretty superficial. I'd redo the boiler and bunker lining to include more of the accurate curved corners, again like I did with most of my Talifin engines. I'd also paint most of the running board and footplate black, as well as giving him his more accurate red side rods. Working on my Talifin Railway project has really given me a lot of insight into how I could recreate this little guy to be a little more accurate. When it comes to remaking my old models to a higher quality, I generally prefer to start from scratch and leave the old model as is. Instead of taking it all apart and using the old model to make the new one, if I were to make a new Skarloey, I would buy a new model for it so I could compare the old and the new. I really like to have that physical record of my growth, and every now and then, I do have something like that to show. But that's a story for next time.